Nobody asked for this. Then, in the vast nothingness of space, it appeared. The Books vs. TV series LOGI trivia. Wait, what? Yang was wearing sunglasses?
This video is sponsored by Common Sense. Common Sense. If only everyone had it. I'm gonna begin by saying that Ginga Eiyu Densetsu is my favorite anime of all time. And this love inevitably led me to where it all began, the books. I've always wanted to see if there is any noticeable difference between the two, and simply believing some random person on Reddit or Twitter who says that they're the same or different is not my way of doing things. Besides, the books were finally translated into English, and were received very poorly as far as user scores go, and even if some of the comments were criticizing the translation, I had no intention to delve into those waters again. I wanted to work with the original language. As per the basics of the hermeneutics, I purchased some old editions of the books. My intention was to have the print date as close as possible to the actual animification date. This means that some inconsistencies between the actual versions of the books that we used during the scripting stage and the books I used may happen, albeit I think they would be very minor, since the author himself was very reluctant to tweak any significant moments post-print. For the past 4 months, I was simply watching every episode, every phrase, every mannerism of the characters, and tried to compare it with what I had in the books, literally side by side. And I expected to see some significant discrepancies between both mediums. This was not the case. In fact, my original plans were almost thwarted because this has to be one of the most faithful adaptations I've ever seen, and I've not seen much, to be honest. Originally, I wanted to just write down the big stuff and make a list out of it. Maybe some characters were not there at all. Maybe the reactions were different. But what actually happened is I began to go full microscopic analysis, because things looked identical. And when I finished the second book, I started to think that this was a pipe dream, and I should just pick something else for the next video. But I decided to go on since the whole process was somewhat enjoyable. Now that I've finished the whole breakdown, I'm proud and glad to say that it was worth the price of 4 months. You see, I have a severe case of meticulosis, and it's the main reason why it took me so long to finish this video. Before we begin, there's a few things that I need to clarify. I'm just a single man who went through 2,300 plus pages, or if I were to show off the way the original author did, 5,300 pages, and 110 episodes. This is just my perspective and thoughts on the subject, but I have a strong feeling that if someone did the same job following the same steps I did, the results would be almost the same. Both English and Japanese are not my native languages, but I still believe that I'm proficient enough to make a video like that. Feel free to correct any inconsistencies or glaring errors. I won't update the video, but I might pin some of the corrections after fact-checking them. This is just one of the sources on the subject. There's enough comparisons of vanilla LOGH anime and Noyathese in Japanese especially, but I was not able to find a comprehensive comparison like mine. I was not referencing any of those at the time though, because I was afraid it would affect my judgment and motivation to get things done. The translation of the book into English is off from time to time. The series had 3 translators, which is in itself a weird thing. Matt Trevolt, who translated volumes from 8 to 10. I consider this to be the best translation. Daniel Huddleston, who translated volumes from 1 to 3, and volume 7. It's a decent translation with minimum mistakes. And Tyron Grillo, volumes 4 to 6. Fucking trash pile of a translation. I will provide you with a few examples of just how wrong things are sometimes. Still, I will reference it for those of you who can't speak Japanese. Now that we're finished with the boring part, let's begin, shall we? The amount of respect shown to the source material is baffling. Usually when in the book someone makes a half smile, or if the guy's eyes are filled with the kind of light tropical rainforest sun has, they will be filled with exactly this color. If the character squints in the book, you can bet your ass he will squint in the anime. Or look at this scene. 部下たちには
どうか寛大な処置を賜りたく。
権威に罪はない。一度の敗戦は一度の勝利で償えばよいのだ。遠路の清慮、ご苦労であった。
閣下、
私はすでに憲府提督を失った。この上刑まで失うことはできぬ。傷が全開するまで静養せよ。しかる後に現役復帰を命じるであろう。
However, that does not mean that every scene is identical. From time to time, like with this little detail here, things are different. Of course, some changes and tweaks with greater semantic value were introduced, but we'll get to that later. Let me get this one thing clear. The anime version is better. And it's not simply because video as a medium inherently has to provide the viewer with greater amounts of information per second. It's because of the overall direction. And I came up with 3 words to describe it. Specifically, synchronization, direct speechification, and character permeation. We'll begin with synchronization. As I was going through the books, I ended up noticing that the order in which things are being presented in the decalogy might differ from the anime adaptation. As you might guess, this could be huge. So I decided to write these things down whenever I consider them to actually make a difference to the way we might feel about anything in the story. At first, I thought that this is done mostly to create mood shifts and split long chapters into easy-to-digest bits. But as I continued on my quest, I realized that this actually has to do with anime being desperate to create a straight line of events. What I mean by it is this. Fisher's death in the novels is at first mentioned in a very brief manner without any specific descriptions and additions being provided. Then later in the same book, the author provides us with more details as to why losing Fisher was a great deal too young. And then in the book number 10, long after his death, all of a sudden there's a brief mention of Fisher's intention to write a book on tactics, which, if it was introduced in the anime in the same manner, would create a shocking disconnect between the viewers and the kind of feeling the book was trying to induce. As a matter of fact, upon finishing volume 6, I considered this to be a completely new scene introduced in the anime adaptation, and it screwed up my original conclusions. So what the creators of the anime did is they dropped a brief conversation between Young and Fisher about him writing a book before the battle. Then they combined bits 1 and 2 into a single scene to leave a more consistent emotional impact on the viewer. This synchronization of the events inevitably does one huge thing. It makes the characterization of every single hero a lot better. When Fisher dies in the book, you're like, well, okay. When Fisher dies in the anime, you're like, because you knew something about him in advance. Or when 2 events with a temporal gap in between them are mentioned within the same chapter, one paragraph after another, and the anime introduces these events in chronological order to the viewer. So how they probably did it is they collected every single bit and scrap about every single character, and they carefully created a straight progression that allowed us to see the development of each character or event. Have you ever seen an AI learning and playing Snake from scratch? If you did, you might have noticed how the starting position of the snake, as well as the direction it was facing when it died, influences its behavioral patterns throughout further generations. If the snake started in the right corner during its first generation and hit a wall by turning left, it will inevitably hesitate to turn left regardless of its starting position for quite a few generations. Sadly, this is exactly the way many people make decisions about their reality. Point is, the order in which we perceive information is very important. Direct speechification. This one is simple. Many things characters do not say aloud, or that are meant as a description of something, are being converted into a direct speech. Sometimes, depending on the character who ends up saying the line, slight changes to the original wording may be introduced, thus contributing to the characterization even more, but the message stays the same. Character permeation. By literally showing us a glimpse of each character here and there, doing doing their own things and helping in their own way, introducing small bits and pieces that involve these characters, letting them say lines that were not originally voiced by them. They create an emotional connection between the viewer and said characters. Literally every single death in the anime has more drama to it precisely because of this. And to say that it's only due to these three factors that the anime version is better would be an understatement. There's a huge amount of little details and even whole episodes being introduced from scratch to develop a character, not to mention voice acting and music. So now I'll go through every single semantically valuable difference between the animation and the books. I will leave out the moments that serve purely cosmetic purpose, like when in the books Reinhard hits the table with his palm as he interrupts the officer, but just raises his voice in the anime, or when the wording of the original is slightly changed, or when someone does not hit the table like that in the book, and focus only on bits and things that might drastically change the way the whole story is perceived. However, I will mention things like characters saying someone else's lines because it affects the characterization and character permeation within the story. The first and the biggest thing to my mind is the way Jessica Edwards is treated in the anime. In order to leave a lasting impression of her, the anime version introduced completely new things, like the scene of Lap's death, her reaction to Lap's death, Young visiting the graveyard, the part where she gets surrounded by TPK. In the book, Yang saves her, albeit in a different, less knightly way, by taking her hand right as Trünicht asks the guards to escort her out. In the book, Yang gets attacked by TPK after he already saved Jessica. In the anime, she is still with him at that moment. Attenborough is also not there. By allowing her to witness the extent to which everything is corrupt firsthand, and all of these first-hand experiences are read in the anime, we're able to respect her even more when she decides to fight the system fair and square. The following sequence of events is also completely new. Her apartment is being watched, so they decide to transport her to Young's apartment. And then Young bargains with Trünicht for Jessica's life. Also, if things went according to the book, since there's no deal between Young and Trünicht to leave her alone, she could have been easily erased by Trünicht after the flight. Like, seriously, this is easy. Battle and its details are very different. There's no Artemis. The first army simply gets defeated, as well as the second one. There's no turtling on the side of Maximilian. Maximilian even annexed Marindorf's territory, who decided to fight back and requested help from Odin, enter Kircheis, and declared his own kingdom. Got baited by Kircheis, who declared his help to Marindorf, forcing Maximilian to think that this is where he's about to go, but instead made a quick turn for Castro, forcing Maximilian to panic and move the forces surrounding Marindorf back to base. And as a result, he gets attacked from behind by Kircheis, who tricked him again, resulting in his complete and utter defeat. The ending is the same, however. He gets killed by his own people who wanted their sins to be absolved. His motivation is also different. He rebelled because Lichtenlade decided to strip a part of his heritage due to the fact that it was obtained by utilizing unfair methods. The kid got really angry and went full Hangaku no Maximilian. He even sent this genetically modified doggo after Ministry of Finance's rep. When this transpired for the second time, he got summoned to the palace, that is Odin. Out of realization that his actions might have angered the officials of the empire, he convinced himself that this is a no-return ticket. Other aristocrats who were close to his family attempted to force him to reconsider, but those efforts were in vain. Thus, Kircheis quelled the rebellion that lasted for half a year in just 10 days. So among the things that are completely new here, 13th Fleet Establishment Ceremony, the scene where Shinkov gets to show off and gets noticed by Young asking Kazonis to get him lots of stuff, and this part is new. Rosenritus, K and R discuss Young's promotion poetically, and for the most part that's pretty much it. But Frederica's first appearance, where she introduces herself in a more militaristic fashion, the most important part here is the fact that this is the first mention of Young wearing sunglasses. There is no rape attempt scene in the book. It is more Reinhard thinking to himself about things he hates the most about the Emperor and the dynasty, among which there is the fact that previous emperor used all his power that he obtained to just jerk off his ego by deifying himself. This thought is expressed in the flashback, although in a very childlike way, which is suitable according to the context they created. And the second one is that he won't make his son inherit the throne. This episode is a filler taking out of Gaiden 01, Hoshi o Kudaku Mono. Not a single detail out of here was mentioned in the decalogy. This episode is built based on Gaiden number 4, probably 30% of it, and a little bit of Gaiden 02, Yurian no Izeron Nikki, probably like 5%, and like a very, very small part of episode 10's unique scenes, which is like another 5% or something. The rest is glued together in the anime wonderfully. This is very important episode for Jessica and Young, and a testament to just how huge of a character they managed to turn her into. This is also based on Gaiden number 1, Hoshi o Kudaku Mono, not a part of the main decalogy, but shows us that shit got personal for Reinhard with that cock-tip haircut dude. The whole fragment from here to here is a mixture of things characters have said all over the book, with slight additions from the anime creators. So this conversation takes place inside their office, not in the car. The car scene actually involved only Julian and Yang. The police officer offered them a bit of extra privilege help, but Yang politely denied it. The thoughts Rebelo expresses here are a part of Yang's long inner monologue. And that inner monologue also mentions that crime rates have risen significantly, especially since soldiers who were previously using performance-enhancing drugs return to a normal society and are unable to integrate. There's no helicopter here, it was just Yang and Julian walking for an hour. All these little jokes and poking happening between Lebero and Stolle, like how he calls him Senso-ya and stuff like that. Trunicht, also arriving via helicopter, points to the fact that he has strengths in the army as well. What they achieve by doing this is we're able to see Lebero as a strong politician who tries to somehow prevent the impending social and economic collapse. The novels get right to the contents of the Congress meeting. The contents themselves are almost the same, with neat little details being introduced in the anime version. So this is a new scene that does two things. Introduces Fork to us as supposed Yang's ideological antagonist, and shows that Greenhill Sr. and Yang shared a lot of thoughts about the current regime, which allows us to get more used to his character. Basically, it's character permeation. In the adaptation, Yang submits his resignation right after Iserlon's fall. This is episode 7. In the book, he does that on the day FBA Supreme Council decides to attack. This order change has significant semantic value. Imagine yourself submitting a resignation after you've done a great job, and submitting it when there's a huge war expedition coming. So this is a completely new episode, not mentioned anywhere. It exists to show us that it was not an easy task to go full scorched earth with these 200 planets, and to create a temporal gap between the main battle and the prelude, so to speak. Episode 14 follows suit by introducing another planet example from scratch, only this time focuses on the FPI side of things. Everything else aside from the events transpiring on the planet is mentioned in the novels, albeit with slight differences from time to time. In the book, pro-war politicians are left speechless and have nothing to object to Rebelo's view, including the pink suit lady, but still decide that there needs to be at least some sort of confrontation before they retreat. Here, she spouts some ideological BS and shows no sign of admitting her fault. In the novel, they are ordered to procure the required provisions/rations/food until the supply fleet arrives. In the anime, this happens only after the supply fleet is intercepted by KPIs. Provisions Fleet Commanding Officer is laughing at the possibility of an ambush whilst playing 3D chess. It's 9 to 11 degrees in the book. In the anime, it's 12 to the left. When the fight erupts in the anime, it's a one-sided blow to the body from Poplin. It is Shankop who stops Poplin from going berserk. not Konev. This is a good change because there's little to no reason why Shenkopf would be here during the battle, and allows Konev to shine a little bit more before his untimely death. This scene always seemed weird to me, because there have been enough examples where ships were fighting that close to each other. The book actually explains why nobody opened fire. It was because there was a risk of an energy storm occurring and taking both sides down. Also, the concentration of ships was so dense that automated evasion systems went haywire to the point where some ships started spinning around because there was no place to go. Bukak mentions different things during this conversation, specifically the fact that he does not like the color of the star, and that it begins with an A, the same as Astarte.
艦長、構成アモリッツァに融合弾を投下してくれ。ローエングラム伯にいつぞやのお返しをしてやろう。多少アレンジしてね。
Now in the book, this is a reference to this part of Wagayuku wa Hoshi no Taikai, where Lowengram pulled off a similar trick. In the book, instead of this noble and typical scene, there is a mention of Ulysses' crew, whose microorganism-infused wastewater treatment system took a blow, resulting in crewmates standing knee-deep in dirt, to put it politely. This little detail will later become the reason why Ulysses will be known as the broken toilet ship or the cracked privet ship in the book. Ironically, it will go on to become one of Young Fleet gems, but we never get to learn about it in the anime. Post-war Alliance events were compressed heavily, but the important stuff is still there. One of the biggest omissions is the fact that after the battle, for a while, Yang started to drink a lot. Like, a lot. His drinking increased dramatically. Julian proposed a change of surroundings and dragged him out of that hole. This little crown bit, among a great deal of other little things, is another addition by the animation staff, as well as the scene that follows immediately afterwards.
一言ご忠告申し上げておく。あの小僧、いや、ローエングラム公は紛れもなき聖戦領略の天才。舐めてかかると手ひどい目に遭いますぞ。では。
The first novel ends with this dialogue. The fact that this is the final conversation of the book is a very strong and maybe even obvious or ominous foreshadowing of the events to come. Animators decided to nonchalantly insert it in the middle of an episode that is based on the second book to not spoil things, I suppose. Very meticulous reordering and synchronization takes place from here to here. In particular, this is the part where Young discusses army as an institution with Julian. It is glued together from Gaiden 02, the second volume of the Decalogy, and newly introduced utterances. It creates a thought transition from, why does Young hate the military so much? To, let's ask Frederica about it, she might know a thing or two. His dialogue with Frederica is also not a part of the main story. Then Julian learns about Alpha Seal and Lynch's backstory, in the form of a recollection/dialogue between the two. In the book, this backstory is just a single sentence. They managed to create a clear flow of thought throughout these scenes, some of which are pure additions, add a bunch of neat details both visually and verbally, making the source material look dry in comparison. On their way, Julian and Young encounter a roadblock. It was later that they found out that it was because of the criminal act committed by the returning soldiers. Apparently, to withstand the horrors of war, one too many of the returning soldiers became addicted to the stimulants and just couldn't return to the civilian life normally. Young hears about the cult from a random soldier who is slightly influenced by the propaganda. Upon hearing the explanation, Young mutters to himself, I suppose the same individual is behind all of this. Here, it's Bukak, and the comment from Young is not there, though it is implied when Bukak says TPK dressed up as fanatics. Kazelnas is actually already in Iserlon at this point. His transfer sort of happened behind the scenes. Here, they made a mini subplot out of it. Last thing of note here pertains to the order in which the information is presented to us in the novel and in the anime. Because in the anime, the part where Lynch gets instigated by Reinhardt to perform a coup is shown before the actual meeting of the revolutionaries, we have a clear understanding that this whole thing is happening according to Reinhardt's scenario. In the book, it is only later that we get a confirmation of our suspicions. Apart from what Mercat says when he is blackmailed into accepting his commanding position, this scene is not as expressive in the novels as you would imagine it to be. In the book, Braunschweig escapes before Reinhardt puts his plan into motion. In the anime, he is forced to escape prematurely because the plan to assassinate Reinhardt has failed. He also barely makes it out alive, mostly thanks to his cowardly tactics of using civilian ships as a living shield. This particular detail was probably added to demonize him even more. Newly introduced segment to create a smooth transition to the FPA's part of the story. But if that was just it, I would have left it out of the whole breakdown. The reason I included it as an example is the fact that by creating these transitions, they allow the viewer to perceive the story as it unfolds on both sides of the coin without losing a sense of time. On the next day after this assassination attempt, an interplanetary missile exploded during maintenance. What's interesting about it is the fact that, unlike the more aggressive direct military-based rebellions in Neptus, Kappa, Shempul, this was more a societal push reminder towards change, since most of the soldiers involved in the explosion were still teenagers, and it showed just how exhausted from war the society is. This incident is accompanied by a speech from Jessica Edwards. But wait, there's more! A few things out of the novel related to the Fox attack on Kubusli. Bukak clearly understands that this incident is not just some random attack. Some officers regretted the fact that they, unlike in the Empire, can't stop the assassination from being covered by the media. It was Trunicht who ordered him to add Kubusli's responsibilities to his list, but Bukak refused, fearing that it would lead to power imbalance and completely paralyze the two branches of the army should he die from a terrorist attack. Upon hearing the news about Dawson's promotion, Bukak later says the following: "Maybe I should have taken the job after all." And we can only guess as to why would he say that. The book gives an explanation.
宇宙艦隊司令長官と兼任するのはまずかろうと断ってしまったが、わしがやった方がマシじゃった。
This little bit here is based on Gaiden 02. It's another synchronization. The part with Kazernu's arrival, as we have already established is already there in the books, is not based on anything, but is very well written. For example, this part here.
家の引っ越しが片付くまで帰ってくるなと女房に言われてね。
キャゼルヌ先輩も家庭内では粗大ゴミの口ですな。
よく言うよ。お前さんなぞユリアンが来る前はゴミの山に埋もれて生息してたくせに。
But wait, there's more actually. This scene serves another purpose. Remember how Bukak commented on the Dawson's assignment?
わしがやった方がマシじゃったかな。
They compress this explanation about why Dawson is a questionable character into this line.
ドーソンは根に持つタイプだと言うからな。お前さんをこき使うつもりなんだろう。
The rest of the scene is the same, but these extra bits add up and become something even greater. This one is also based on Gaiden 02, but the part where he asks Young for permission to go with him is a cosmetic addition. It looks as if he's forced to go because he proposed this particular plan. However, this proposal is completely unrelated to the scene that follows afterwards. As a matter of fact, he ends up going just because hot-headed aristocrats wanted to win once to bolster everyone's morale. It has nothing to do with Odin's sneak attack. In reality, what happens here is they all want a piece of that honorable pie. He who takes Odin takes it all was their predominant ideology. Therefore, at that moment, it became palpable that everyone is fighting for himself out there. And Staden, having realized that he opened up this problem of unity with his proposal, ends up biting his lip in the anime. Staden is not sick in the book, he just ends up retreating, though the book implies that he may have been injured during the battle. I always thought, like, just fucking storm it with ships and everything, what's your problem? Oberstein simply says that's the best way, but why would I be convinced with that? There was a risk of a nuclear explosion. Very great design, engineers. A fortress that cannot withstand concentrated fire and gets blown to bits. Genius. Offlesser is a talented cook, it would seem. Also, he's drugged mindlessly at the moment. In the book, Shenkop uses sleeping agent to put Bagdash to sleep. In the anime, he tweaks his tank bed. Bagdash's leak about the 11th Fleet was correct in the books. In the anime, however, he mixed simple truth into a dangerous lie. Doria battle is quite different. Strategically, they dismissed a few details, like the fact that the enemy chose to split its forces in two to pincer Young's fleet in the book. But since Young's troops were able to arrive earlier, it allowed them to position themselves in a super efficient way. Tactically, the battle unfolds completely the same, except for the fact that we think that we battled the whole 11th Fleet, and not its half. Yang jokingly makes a reference to the sleeping Lobos and goes to bed himself for 2 hours prior to battle. Yang's eureka moment, where he celebrates his strategical success, is cut out. Surrendering Officer adds glory to FPA in his suicide speech before he blows his brains out in the anime. Nice touch again, showing that he fought for his country, albeit in a different way.
Here's what Shankov keeps to himself during this battle.
The other half of the 11th Fleet, that was split strategically, is confused and tries to decide what to do next. It ends up getting distracted by Fisher, who is not with Yang in the book at the moment, en route to the main battle. When the young fleet arrives to his help, because at this point the first half of the fleet is gone, the battle is decided. Stadium Slaughter also has a few interesting details. The novel actually spoils what's about to happen. Of course, in the anime we have no idea. The name of the officer is also sort of referential, Captain Christian. Upon hearing the news of her death, Yang puts on his sunglasses. This spray soothes pain, disinfects the wound, and creates a protective layer, and this guy here starts drinking rubbing alcohol and comments it with the stupidest thing ever said in LOGH. The book never mentions that any of these events were an inside job by any of the Oberstein spies. In the book, Reinhardt just says, okay, with a heavy heart. In the anime, they added a few subtle things. He doesn't accept it and orders to send a small squadron to monitor the planet because he needs to think about it. This does the following to the Reinhardt's character in the future. He did not completely accept Oberstein's proposal and tried to do everything in his power to stop it in case he decides to not follow with his plan. And it also sets up Oberstein as the kind of guy who would make everything happen behind his ruler's back to make things go his way. I always found it sort of weird, but the book gives an explanation as to why they were able to easily wipe out the whole planet with a nuclear strike. And the reason is because it is arid. And people concentrated at about 50 oasis areas because the rest is just dunes. Kirchheis hears about the nuclear strike from Steinmetz. In the book, it was one of the soldiers who were ordered to perform the strike who told him that. They both felt as if something dear to them both, something unseen to the eye, has broken without a sound. Reinhardt also understands that all he has to do is apologize. At 0540, Wagner's Tristan und Isolde's prelude blesses our ears. The reason why this could be some next level foreshadowing is because Kirchheis also dies with Reinhardt's name on his lips, but this happens later in the story during Act 3. Since we only hear the first part of the melody, it could also reference Isolde's rage at Tristan for breaking his promise, or maybe the part where Tristan refuses to appear before her and stays at the helm. Then again, there are examples like later in episode 26 when Kirchheis dies accompanied by the first movement of Bruckner's 7th Symphony, and background-wise I'm not sure there's any connection there, aside from the fact that the first movement, according to the composer, came to him in a dream, and Reinhardt's in a sort of like a dreamlike state right now. Or maybe because Ludwig II was also very young when he succeeded the throne, which Reinhardt's about to do. In any case, sometimes I just can't find the connection history-wise. It does sound terrifyingly grand though, but this is purely subjective. This is an actual metaphor from the book, being meticulously reproduced by the animators. Attenborough is aboard the battleship Triglav, or the Three-Head, which is in the book supposed to be a Slavic war god, but in reality is the god of God knows what. A top-of-the-line war machine, it didn't become Young's flagship, according to his own words, precisely because it was too beautiful, which was probably a joke, or because it was a drag for Young to move his commander seat. There's no Poplin comes to save the day in the book. Julian barely makes it out alive. I like the book's interpretation more, because it just shows how hard it was for Julian to survive his first battle, and this sense of loneliness contributed greatly to his mental state. And then the anime proceeds to gain 10 points for Gryffindor by introducing the engineer to the scene, whom Julian literally has to abandon to survive. Without this engineer, the scene of him barely escaping the exploding ship Immortal is undoubtedly less dramatic. This cat is not mentioned in the novels, despite the fact that the word cat, or neko, is being mentioned in one way or another in every volume of the main story, except for volume 9. Well, that's pretty sad. You can find a more detailed description of how Julian and Young met in the first volume, but it went just as you would imagine it. This is where the story about that time when Julian did not keep his promise pops up. He was supposed to feed their neighbor's nightingale, but went to training and skipped it. As a punishment, he had no food for evening. Even a boy as responsible as Julian has his not-so-bright moments, and I think this is a nice touch. A few things worth mentioning here. In the book, soon after admitting that it's not his skill that convinced the commissioner, he moves on to discuss Boris Konev, whom they recruited as a spy. The novels provide us with an explanation as to why exactly there is a possibility for coexistence should Young ever come into power. The contents of this whole conversation in the anime between Hilda, Mecklinger, and Heinrich are non-existent in the Decalogy, except for the part where she asks Mecklinger about the surprised look on his face when he entered Heinrich's bedroom. In the novel, Schumacher had a bad premonition about meeting Alfred, since he caused mutiny on his friend's Flegel's ship, resulting in his death. Ironically enough, the young aristocrat didn't recognize another commoner in front of him. I always considered it to be rather odd that Trünicht allowed a member of the opposition to be at this interrogation-like court of inquiry. Young thinks to himself that it's probably because Trünicht wanted to keep an air of fairness. Shockingly identical, except for slight tweaks to the Frederica's battle subplot. In particular, this moment here, where Bay reports back to Trünicht about Frederica going berserk, and this little moment here, where she gets assaulted by TPK. According to the book, the Edmund Messersmith is just a nice guy who helps Frederica out, and drops a slightly floaty comment even. There's no ambush taking place, she just goes straight to Bucock's office. On his way to Heinesen, Young hears about another tragic incident caused by inexperience.
Two small things.
Trünicht and Negroponte meeting at 1854, and the fact that Negroponte does not drop on his knees as he begs Young to not hold a grudge. There is an explanation as to why Gaiusberg's main cannon was able to penetrate Iserlohn's armor. Basically, the reason why all of a sudden they fight with axes and tomahawks is the fact that the angle at which they're descending keeps them within the blind spot. Iserlohn's gravitational field is 10 kilometers long. This might seem like a minor detail, but in later volumes, its gravitational pull caused the death toll to rise. They were trying to cause laser-induced thermonuclear microexplosion, or I don't know, like a laser-triggered hydrogen bomb? The explosion of Gaiusberg has killed 80% of the remaining troops. What happens here is Müller had 4 ribs piecing his lungs and literally forced it back where it belongs with his breathing technique. Just to be clear, what Rubinsky means here is he needs to keep his potential enemy as close as he can instead of allowing him to run rampant. Okay. I'm probably gonna have a hard time explaining this, but basically, it has to do with the way they directed these events. This is another example of synchronization and character permeation. You see, in the book, the scene where Müller bows down is revealed to us before the whole pendant routine. Albeit it is mentioned that it happened prior to the apology, we as a reader receive this information afterwards, which heavily affects the way we perceive his forgiveness. We should be surprised in the books, I suppose.
Reinhardt threw his glass on the floor when he heard the news is also a detail described post-factum. Moreover, it is not mentioned who exactly delivered the news to him. Oberstein fixed perfectly. And of course, there's no mention of Hilda being there during these events. So what they did here is they used the conversation with Hilda, which is an unrelated scene in the novel 3, as a starting point, and created a straight line of events, i.e. synchronized the flow of the information, included all these little details that each of the characters felt at the moment.
For example, this little part is supposed to show the viewer what Hilda thought about Oberstein during her conversation with our young leader, and the fact that she was worried about him. This part is a lively addition to their conversation.
そうか、やっぱりな。周りにろくな性格のやつがいないからな。キャゼルヌだろ、シェーンコップだろ、それにポプランとくれば。
誰か忘れていませんか？
アッテンボローか？
もっと身近な一番の責任者のことです。
In the novels, his reply to Julian's commentary is grumbling that begins at 1707. There are fragments like that here and there, but this one felt special to me, so I decided to mention it for purely subjective reasons.
Are you fucking kidding me? Her scarf is orange, not Aqua-ish! This here is all Schumacher's thoughts being voiced by this character, who is not even there in the book. Schumacher feels very odd that he was dragged into this, and is very rational about what's going on. As you might have already guessed, the elevator scene is not there as well. This is also just Schumacher's thoughts. What this changes is basically his portrayal. He's rational and keeps things to himself. Schumacher looks more like a man of action here, especially after the elevator scene. He doesn't care about this noble guy that much, and it makes perfect sense from his standpoint. I still find it odd that he sides with him here. He just didn't feel like correcting Landsberg about the beer was worth it. He also drops this great quote in the novel. So the amount of information being delivered is mostly the same, but the delivery itself is quite different, inevitably causing some connotations to affect the way we perceive our young kidnappers. But wait, there's more! As a matter of fact, this scene was added to create another chronologically correct chain of events, and connect the dots basically. In particular, the events of episode 37 at 0833 and at 1222. Without the elevator scene to show us just how strongly he ensured their safety, he does feel like a small pawn, unable to affect the unfolding events in any way. Which is funny, because the fact that he demanded for some sort of diversion and other things is mentioned in the books, albeit in a rather descriptive manner. Maybe that's precisely the reason why it comes off this way. A trivial thing to a keen observer, but it was news to me that this kid belonged to an opposing faction of her own brother. Another newly introduced bit that serves one purpose: to show us that it was not an easy decision for Ryan Hod. A small detail, but he calls it burlesque, not farce. I suppose they used the Japanese synonym / analog because the audience would have no idea what he means, but usually the anime version picks the latter for the sake of world building. The easiest example would be Grunewald instead of Midori no Mori. He's a well-educated man after all. Hilda's conversation with Anna Rose is one of the many examples that demonstrate just how much respect there was for the originals. It is 100% identical. So identical that when there's a loud crack emerging from the fireplace, it emerges at the exact same moment. When shadows dance on their faces, they do just that. Of course, the angel metaphor is no exception. Yoshiki Tanaka is definitely no stranger to irony whenever he comes up with a name for a ship. This ship's name is Rocinante, Don Quixote's horse. A horse that is past its prime and is engaged in a task beyond its capabilities. I don't have any proof that this is precisely why the author decided to give this name to the ship, but looks like a very obvious connection. Wait a second, what the hell? This translation is weird. What the hell? It's Count von Remscheid let out the kind of phrase that made Rupert hold his laughter. Not Count von Remscheid asked him to forgive his spontaneous laughter. I wonder if there's more blunders like that from now on. It is not the goal of this video to analyze those, so I will simply provide official English translation of the novels as a reference. So, where was I? This give it up for this imperial dude behind the scenes bit is a pure addition, which obviously reinforces the drama. Huang elaborates on his metaphor, outlining the ingredients, his personal qualities. In particular, lust for power and unquestionable faith in his own righteousness are not there. And if he literally aimed for the highest seat in the country, he would not behave the way he did during the court of inquiry. Yang would seek to make an ally even out of those whom he hates. Rebelo objects by mentioning not only the fact that the situation might force Yang to reconsider, but also clearly shows his despise for the pro-Trunicht faction by calling them pigs, and saying that people often consider exchange of their dignity to be a fair price for power. And the translation is wrong again. God damn it. This is surprising, considering the amount of times animators not only preserved things but made them better, but the book does a better job of characterizing Rebelo in this scene. The information about Trunicht's even greater involvement in the military affairs, Kubusli's forced resignation, Dawson's rise to power, is presented to us via their conversation, but is not a part of their dialogue in the book. This is not mentioned in the anime, but members of the legitimate imperial government are literally afraid of their young ruler's potential development into a mindless tyrant. So shocked they
are with the way this kid turned out to be, they keep him sedated in order to hide him from public eye. Young was very furious about Julian's transfer. He even regretted the fact that he did not take the power when he had the chance to for a second. This is where he squeezes his beret as if it was someone's neck, a metaphor that is nearly impossible to translate into pure image. Now, keep your eyes on Young and the beer can he's holding.
提督
ああ、座っていいかな、ここに。
どうぞ。最前線になるでしょ。僕はこちらにいた方がお役に立つと思いますけど。
実はそこなんだユリアン。正解 ABC。 こいつは飛躍しすぎた考えかもしれないし、フェザーンを額面通り合理的な現実主義者の集団と思い込んでいると足をすくわれることになるかもしれない。宗教か。なるほどね。
See, this is what the anime version does almost everywhere. They take this can, follow every single detail mentioned about it in the source material, and sprinkle in a little bit of details here and there. I think some of you might be interested in what actually Young thinks to himself during that moment. The whole Rose and Rita send-off routine is new. Feels so authentic though that I ended up checking the source material time and time again. There's only one thing that needs to be mentioned about this episode, and that is the fact that this whole information was provided to the reader in the first volume. So this is something that we know in advance. How this whole world came to be, why for some weird reason the Empire gives off this Germanic vibe. In the anime, all these little details are mentioned 39 episodes later, at which point you either accept these quirks and move on, or give up and watch your ReZero or something. The way they present this information looks very authentic. Structurally, there are some changes here, but semantically, everything is the same. This particular declaration of war had a loud name to it with heavy supply-based implications.
Certain details about Royenthal's womanizing habits. Among the things that might interest you, he never dated two women at once. This little bit that confuses Royenthal about women, and his wives don't count as women statement. He even, probably, had a fight with Mitsumae about that one, but both claim that they don't remember what happened.
In case you didn't notice such an obvious thing, these leaves are dancing polka. Back then, Young was captain, but Julian, in his memories, ended up calling Young by his current rank, which is admiral. I missed this one until I read about it in the book. Julian might have developed more intense romantic feelings for Frederica had he not known that she fancied Young. I never got this idea from the adaptation, Julian, but it does make sense to a certain point. Later it is mentioned that he did have feelings for her. It is Mashengo who notifies him that they're about to reach Fezan in the adaptation, whilst in the book it is just an interphone notification. This is how they melt him into the story and create a stronger emotional connection with this character between both the viewer and Julian. Julian might not look like the part, but he is the youngest military attaché out there. This fact has led to a certain level of jealousy directed at him. Julian was exhausted after the evening party, had a brief thought about battling Reinhardt himself, and began to understand why people are drawn to alcohol. What exactly goes on with Baltic at the moment is he lulls Fezan into a sense of false safety by feeding it false information about military maneuvers of the Empire, and he gradually convinces himself that Rubinsky is not worthy to rule. In the book, Young says support/help Bukok. In the anime, it provides covering fire. This might seem like a minor thing, but these minor things serve a great purpose. They create an aura of amity between the characters, demonstrate how they feel about each other, and thus contribute greatly to the character development.
しかもいずれの論は陽動、本体はフェザーン行きときたぜ。
Okay, so here comes the part that always confused me. How the hell were they able to sneak up on 30,000 ships and then safely return? Sure, maybe for some miraculous reason they managed to succeed with their decoy-based sneak attack, but returning in front of 30,000 ships in outer space is like fucking impossible. And I really hope to see some kind of explanation or anything in the books pertaining to their return, but no, Chenkov just nonchalantly returns back. Let's just say I'm not convinced.
You can, however, attempt to explain it like this. They escaped by the means of Imperial escape pods, and since you have no idea who's on board of those, you won't shoot those down, right? Even if they move in the general direction of Isolon, but that might be just the gravitational pull, or what if they'd taken someone hostage? Frederica does not offer Young to rest a little in his quarters, so there's no cat to men happening in the book. The whole trigger an explosion within Fortress to push back the liquid metal, Roenthal seeing an opportunity for an attack, 70% charge rate Thor hammer launch routine is not in the book. This segment especially feels like some high stakes action and reinforces the feeling that both parties are fighting at their wits' end, so I'm glad they added it. Another peculiar number manipulation takes place when Rupert mentions Rubinsky's tenure. It's 4 years in the anime, but in the book it's 7 years. The public execution does take place in the book, but the details are not there. This little dialogue that takes place in the background is one of those details, for example. And thus ends the volume 4. This conversation does not take place in the book, although thoughts expressed here will be dispersed throughout the whole decalogy. Let's talk a little bit about Sun's promotion. You see, everything goes exactly as it is mentioned in the book, except for one thing, a sense of urgency. Sun gets promoted right on the spot as he reports to Bukok the news about his aid. It is mentioned, however, that his promotion was an extreme measure. A few things worth noting about Sun that are mentioned in the book. His full name is spelled as follows. All sorts of people made fun of him all the time because of it. Later, Sun will end up changing his family name to Su. So the anime sort of foreshadows his deep-seated ambition by making Royenthal repeat to himself the phrase, "try taking over the country/galaxy." In the book, it is said only once, and is not the closing phrase of the chapter. This elevator is not mentioned anywhere in the book. Pretty thing, eh? He drops this rendition of Caesar's utterance at the beginning of the chapter. In the anime, they move it at the end of Julian's journey and use it as a concise closing statement, again reinforcing the dramatic impact. Mitamai's fleet assembles at the Polovitz star system. I googled it and it makes perfect sense now. So this is supposed to be another Slavic god of war that in reality serves God knows what purpose and looks like this. Now, keep in mind the following. In addition to a mature sun, the star system boasted 4 gas giants. Guess what time is it now? It's side note time! I suppose even Porowith doesn't know why would the translator dismiss the fact that it's a Slavic deity, but whatever. Fahrenheit is forced to give up on his idea of striking the opponent from the rear, not because the superflow emerges, although it does surface later in the book, but because he got too close to the Rantimario. What happens is Deus Ex Machina. On board, electronics started going haywire because of the planet's heat and magnetic fields. But if you base their judgment solely on the visual representation in the anime, there is no way he'd be too close to the Rantimario based on their current position. There is no.
出番に備えて部隊の袖まで行って待つか。は？艦隊を減衰閣下直営艦隊の脇まで移動させる。シラツ・ラッツェンレイターの存在をアピールなさるのですか？
The flow was ahead of Bittenfeld the whole time, and he just went for it. Sweet mother of Deus Ex Machina.
そうだ。敵艦に致命傷を与えず動力部だけを破壊して漂流させるのだ。動けない味方艦が間にいては敵も攻撃できんだろう。
This is also news to anyone who has read only their novels. Chapter 5 of the Volume 5 opens up with a lengthy outline of Heinesen's condition. The novel allowed me to appreciate this phrase of Young even more. Throughout the whole conversation, he avoids the word country, nation, state, motherland intentionally. Young was about to explode with a long speech. I always thought that he just felt uneasy about this whole charade, but Frederica saved his reputation. For those of you who had a hard time understanding what Young meant by that, here's a little something from the book. The novel gives us more information as to why the supply fleet was somewhat important. It carried a year's worth of supplies and factories to support the front line for 20% of his army. That is, if the number 100 million is to be trusted. Maybe precisely because it's 20% that Reinhardt did not assign someone of a higher rank for this mission. This is where Julian dubs Young, grumbling, griping Yusuf II. The decision to delete this reference was probably taken because the viewers would not be able to recall an admiral briefly mentioned during the episode 40. There's a whole gaiden devoted to him and his friends, if you're interested. Only 20% of Steinmetz's troops have survived the Black Hole battle.
お幸せに。
The author's commentary after this phrase might dismiss certain misconceptions about this scene. The last utterance of Sheinkopf in this conversation is Young's thoughts processed and stuck into his mouth. Here's how it goes in the book. Super important. Yang is sitting atop his desk as per usual in the book. Always confused me because the way she reacts, it's like he's bleeding or something. Here's what goes on inside of her head at the moment. Trunaisen's reckless charge is just reckless in the book. So they had to explain his reasoning behind this weird maneuver, which is exactly what they did. Here's what happens here and why Merkatz is so impressed. He lures the part of the Imperial fleet vanguard that was not under Trunaisen's command into the concave formation and rains concentrated fire on them. The timing is so impeccable that even Merkatz ends up praising it aloud. This particular scene here is anime only and is there to create greater emotional impact on the viewer when the news of Konev's death arrive. The whiskey bottle is empty in the novel. One can only guess why would they remove such a nice detail in the anime version. This knot actually has far more to it than you probably could have imagined. Reinhardt did not appreciate that much Oberstein's tactical prowess. For those of you who might have thought that this meteorite decoy is quite weird, here's an excerpt from the book. Everything Mueller says here is newly introduced. His aid provides the viewer with the information that we'll be able to read about only after the flashback explaining their early arrival. This Bucock's opening statement, the first half of it till 1237, is one of my favorite quotes of all time. Imagine my surprise when I found out that it's not in the book. Here's what he says. Oh, this one is also newly introduced phrase to foreshadow his ambition. One of the best examples of how breaking a single series of events in the book into different scenes within the anime contributes to the dramatization of the narrative would be how they split Reinhardt's reaction to the anticlimactic resolution of this battle into two separate scenes. In the novel, oddly enough, we only get to see Reinhardt's reaction to Young's withdrawal after they finish discussing the Sherwood. This is like eternity after. And we've already received an explanation about literally everything else pertaining to Heinesen's surrender, / capitulation. If they preserved this order, your average viewer would go, oh, so Reinhardt was confused and angry, okay. But the way it is shown in the anime, they synchronize our confusion with Reinhardt's. When the viewer shares the feelings of the character, this is when your story truly becomes brilliant. Remember, it's the timing that impressed Merkatz during this battle, but that's not all. As I have already said, they split his reaction into two separate scenes. The first one is an explosion, an impulse, an impetus. The second one is the realization / cliffhanger. It perfectly sums up what we've seen throughout this episode and leaves a lasting impression, allowing many to consider what he said as the credits roll. This is achieved by simply changing the order in which we receive the information about certain events. And sometimes that's all you need to create a compelling narrative. This whole scene would be identical if not for the kiss and the whole subtle hand on the shoulder present in the anime.
亡命政権はどうしたか。
問題は彼らに立てまつられた予定の行方です。
司法権の問題も含めて同盟領の今後の支配をどのようにするか、K が中心になって随行してきた行政専門家の意見を取りまとめよう。
Newly added scene that gives us a breakdown of their status quo. This question is not in the book, judging by the fact that the wording is exactly the same as when he saw Mashengo aboard his ship without permission. This is an intended reference joke by the authors of the anime. The huge reshuffle takes place. Here's the order in which the post-war information is served to the reader. Basically, in the book we get a batch of events related to Reinhardt and then a batch of events related to Young. And here's what the anime team did with it. I could waste another 10 minutes trying to explain to you why it's better, but this video is already too long for that. One word. Synchronization. The young empress would receive a ton of money yearly for the rest of her life. Volume 5 contains an author's commentary. In short, Legend of the Galactic Heroes is based on another 100-page work of the author that was supposed to be published under the name of A Game of Chess on a Galactic Scale. Originally, Young showed a lot more restraint and would never bitch about his pension. The author regretted the fact that he killed Kiki Eyes too early. Okay, another huge reshuffle. The beginning has this whole introductory feel to it because it was aired 2.5 years after the end of the previous episode. It marks a beginning of the 3rd season. Most of the static descriptions were adapted as a dialogue. According to the book, it was his personal desire to keep things to a minimum during public events, not an order from Reinhardt. But if the people were to judge this scene based on the official translation, they would be confused to no end. And again, the scarf is orange! If I were to name a character who was simply brought to life thanks to the anime adaptation, it's Bruno von Silverberg. His assignment is a lot more memorable. They converted it into a dialogue that preserves all of the details present in the book and add this part where he's at a loss for words. This spontaneous element makes this scene and his character much more memorable, at least to me. This character has no personality, no charisma in the book whatsoever. It's mostly descriptive text. Kimmel had a congenital metabolic disorder, by the way. So the wedding. The feeling of the scene is the same, but anime again manages to bring it to 11 by adding bits and pieces here and there. I'm talking about things like Kazona's commentary on Young's appearance, his unbuttoned suit. This conversation as Young and Frederica walk down the aisle is a newly introduced scene completely. It sets up the topic of Julian's upcoming journey to Earth, reveals to us the name and history of Connor's new ship before the departure. In the Decalogy, this happens when they have already reached the Earth's orbit, thus establishing this nice connection between the ship's name and what Julian's about to do. The books do not mention that it was Young who came up with the name, only that he ordered the transfer to be made. This adds more subtlety to the ship's name, because it turns it into a joke that reflects how Young feels about his protege's departure. I'm also not sure whether undutinous is a carefully woven neologism by the author, or just another victim of Japanese. In any case, the intended meaning is explained to us by Kazuna in the anime, and precedes the ship's English name in the novels. Rebel introduced pay cuts as an anti-crisis measure. He cut a quarter of his own salary, whilst the other officials received a 12.5% cut. Our marshals lost 22.5% of his pension, and Frederica's pension cut amounted to 15%. This is mentioned briefly in episode 59. Young might look like an honorable man in the anime, but he actually used to drink himself mindless on the election day. Young actually had a plan on how to overthrow the Imperial occupation even in such a desperate situation. Julian's intermissions on his way to Earth were synchronized and direct speechified, which created an engaging flow of events. In the Volume 6, we would hear about the troubles Young's protege had post-factum when he had already reached the Earth safely, which completely removes any hint of suspense there could be. Ironically enough, the novel says it clearly that had it not been for the order Steinmetz imposed on his troops, to not pester the civilians that is, Julian's journey would have been short-lived. This whole episode is very close to the Decalogy. I can only mention this sarcastic article by a journalist missing from the serialization. So, episode 57 introduces a few nice details and synchronizations, but nothing too important to be mentioned explicitly. During that moment, Reinhardt was very irritated by Hilda's absence, which influenced his judgment. Oberstein was known as the Ice Sword among some people. I've only noticed this once I read it in the book, but while most people used a lot of negative words whenever they referred to Oberstein, Mittermeier only called him that Oberstein. I've always wondered who exactly she's fighting against. Sorry for being that stupid. The book cleared my thoughts on that one. It's Oberstein and his lapdogs. About these flowers, there's a little bit more in the novel. I know this is very important, but there you go. Evangeline serves them sausages and cottage cheese. I know that this is probably implied here, but I never paid it that much attention. Oriental took her virginity. Technically, this is a rape, but she tried to kill him, so I'm not sure what to make of it. One hell of a way to start a relationship, I suppose. So this look is supposed to show us that for some odd reason, she had hoped he'd turn around. The book helped me notice this, but Black Flag Force's abbreviation is BFF. People believe that Dubelia's room has ghosts of the drowned in it. The notion that only made him laugh inside. Another wrong translation. Lennenkampf was only 4 years older than Young, but it looked like there's a gap of at least 20 years between the two. This is exactly how it looks in the anime. And for fuck's sake, the translation is wrong again. According to the book, Udo Dieter Hummel, Lennenkampf's chief of staff, reported everything his superior did to Oberstein. This is very important because it shows us how Oberstein could have orchestrated this whole chain of events. I looked for anything that could imply this connection, but sadly could not find it. Or maybe we're supposed to gather all of this information by this smug of his, followed by Lennenkampf being summoned by Oberstein later within the same episode. An explicit explanation as to why would anyone from FPA report Young to Lennenkampf. Basically, they saw that Schrönicht is doing well by selling off his homeland and decided to follow suit. Not to mention the fact that they despised Young. Duh. According to the book, Frederica also contacted Central Police Station and confirmed the affiliation of the uninvited guests. Frederica is a great shot. This basically means that later she just gets too flustered. She has one more line in the book in this scene, and I like it, so here you go. The prosecutor apparently divided people only in two categories: those who have committed a crime and those who are about to. He was measuring Young with the look of a cook who's about to cook an ingredient. But the guy with the keyboard who recorded the meeting was introduced in the anime version. One phrase was removed from the conversation between Schenkoff and Attenborough. Young thinks to himself about one more detail here. Originally, he thought that he had at least 5 to 6 years to prepare. This thought would be repeated in the next volume as well. In the anime, he openly opposes Rebelo. Here's what he comes up with in the book at that time, but does not voice aloud. Out of the arguments presented by Young, 2 are newly introduced. If sacrifice is the highest virtue, then those who survive by sacrificing others are the lowest of humanity. The one who needs to be worrying about his reputation in the future is Rebelo. The part about Attenborough's memoirs is not in the book, surprisingly enough. It might not be that clear in the anime, but Schenkoff and Attenborough had a plan devised actually. First, they cause uproar to attract the Empire's attention to Levero's movements. Second, they control the chaos in a way that would convince Lennenkampf that he can deal with the situation on his own. And third, they flee the planet and meet up with mogrts. The 2 of them, however, were worried if Young would agree to make him move like that. But for that purpose, the 2 devils tried to use Frederica to influence his decision-making process. Usually, Rebelo's escort consisted of 2 cars, but now it's 4. This is where the author mentions the fact that the decline of governing ability is always proportionate to the amount of guarding measures. The book only mentions that they infiltrated military communications. Bagdash seems like a great fit, but he enters the scene quite some time later.
何か最後の望みは終わりですか、閣下。
そうだね。ぜひ宇宙歴870年ものの白ワインを飲んでから死にたい。
無理なご注文には応じられません。
I'm an idiot. I'm an idiot. Of course this was a joke. It's the year 799, and he mentions the 870 year wine. The book mentions that it took the god about 5 seconds to get it, and it took me more than 5 years to finally see it. Thanks, novel. Now, I think I'm not the only person here who never paid any attention to this thing Young is holding. Turns out, it's a cuffling disguise tracking device implemented into the suit Frederica handed over to Young as he was escorted out. This is the reason why they were able to reach him fast enough, and literally the reason why he's alive now. Funny how both the book and anime do not mention it until after Young is saved. Another great detail is, he puts it into the pocket of his military uniform, both as a charm and as a precautionary measure. Turns out, their hideout was just 1 kilometer away from Lennenkampf. They sort of tried to imply it visually, I suppose. The part from 1400 till 1430 is a newly introduced micro-event. This episode's name, The Bloody Cascade, is supposed to be a reference to these stairs right here.
So what they did here is they split the events pertaining to Wallen's coma into two parts. The part before he falls into coma and the part where he wakes up. The book has these two parts merged into one, and we immediately see that 60 hours later he wakes up. This completely removes any suspense from the scene. The anime introduces Julian's segment in between these two parts, allowing the viewer to get worried about Wallen's future. I mean, the whole attack might get cancelled because of that, you know?
This might have been an innocent attempt at synchronization,
but I sense a greater design here. They always picked the time when there were the least people around. Julian and Poplin toilet scene has 2 more lines in it in the novel. Among coughing fits, Julian withdrawal symptoms also included violent trembling, arrhythmia, intense shivering, muscle pain, vomiting, lack of appetite. The feeling was close to the harshest G-force training has ever experienced. Overall mood and madness of the battle is perfectly preserved in the anime, with addition of small details to make it even better. For example, the book mentions just the fact that Konov has lost his crewmate. This scene in the book is just a guy with a knife who gets defeated, so they basically allowed the guy with the knife to land a deadly strike first on one of Konov's crewmates before he gets taken down. Same amount of information, completely different feel. Now I'm going to provide you with 2 sequences describing the same events to illustrate why the anime version is a lot better. Here's how the whole thing goes down in the book. And here's what the anime did based on all that. A ridiculous amount of micro scenes, newly introduced small bits and pieces that are sprinkled all over the narrative without disrupting the harmony. If anything, I'd call that a small achievement. As Oberstein leaves the room, Reinhard thinks to himself that he should have ignored Oberstein's push against Royenthal and sent him to Heinessen as the young emperor had originally intended. This fact, along with a few other details from the book I've mentioned before, allows us to see just how harmful Oberstein's actually proved to be to the Empire. It doesn't matter that Oberstein in his own way seeks to carve out the better way for the Empire. In the end, he orchestrated things in a way that would result in Reinhard putting the kind of hard-headed men who would be easy to manipulate into Young's assassination in a position of power. He kept tabs on Lennenkampf through his chief of staff. It was Oberstein who promoted the said assassination to Lennenkampf. This resulted in further escalation and destabilization of the situation, further antagonizing people like Royenthal and Mittermeier against him. It also adds a lot more meaning to Royenthal's thoughts here.
オーベルシュタインごときの傀儡になり下がったのでは、興ざめも甚だしいというものだ。
And while I previously thought that Oberstein has a lot of redeeming traits, now I think that he literally fucked things up in so many ways throughout the story that it should be surprising how he didn't end up being executed. And this is actually funny if you think about it. This has to do a lot with morals within the organization. Simply put, if Oberstein tried to execute the same plan under Golden Bone regime, he probably would have succeeded. But I digress. Harun had a lot more going in her mind than we end up hearing. Basically, what happens here is she recalled her mother's words that her current posture looks a lot like her father's, and this gets on her nerves, which is why she ventilates it on the cup with alkali-treated protein drink. By the way, in the book, within the same scene, Julian pops up in her mind, and she ends up saying what she said in episode 55.
何？あんな軟弱そうなやつ。
Notice her posture in this scene as well. So basically, they split the scene and moved her thoughts about Julian to the episode where they meet for the first time, both permeating her presence in the story and reinforcing the connection between the two. This little revelation concludes Volume 6. This whole episode is riddled with reshuffles, synchronizations, and direct spechifications. So many descriptive, dry facts get converted into some sort of interaction. Examples might include this conversation with Kazonis. If the anime followed the book's structure, the part with rumors would be at the very least mentioned at the end of this episode, which would completely ruin the dynamics of plot development within this particular episode.
A bunch of Young's thoughts about their current predicament, sprinkled all over the book, were consolidated and converted into a natural-looking discussion with his wife at 11:03. The metaphor involving salt, pepper in his dish is also part of the adaptation. I was really surprised when I discovered that the line of Chung Woo-chang, the breadman, about killing the snake while it's still in the egg, and the part where he says that he'll fight Young if he's ordered to, even though there is no chance of winning, are two separate conversations in the book. They look perfect together, like bread and butter. Then again, both are mentioned within the same part of the same chapter, so it was not that hard to come up with that idea, I suppose. Yulian's growth, military rank-wise, was very fast. Starting from 20 to 30 is another synchronization slash reshuffle that functions as a segue into the next episode, and the book actually begins by describing the events of the next episode, not this one. Basically, they pull off a synchroniception here, because not only do they create a linear timeline within the episode, they also do so between the episodes. This part with Steinmetz is actually mentioned in the middle of the book, but here it connects the episodes. By the way, this guy's name is Krusenstern. Oberstein goes to the bathroom. If anyone's interested, Oberstein is afraid that if Young joins their ranks, he will be very close to becoming his much-hated number 2. This is reinforced by the fact that throughout this decalogy, it is mentioned multiple times that Young had a psychological predisposition towards being number 2. She adds the Church of Terror remnants to the list. This is a newly added scene that adds depth to Silverback's character. They created a whole scene based on his 2 ambitions that are revealed to us in the volume 8 of the Decalogy. The book does mention that Grill Pouter received the news of his article being accepted during Lenenkamp's funeral, but does so way after the whole event was described in the book. Basically, another synchronization. This is where the book drops a huge exposition and the dialogue on the subject of wives between Royenthal and Mittermeier, disrupting the immersion of the reader, to be honest. That's why the animators move these things to other, context-wise more fitting scenes. Here's another occasional demonstration of just how detailed this adaptation was.
世に居城など必要ない。世のあるところがすなわち銀河帝国の王城だ。当分は戦艦ブリオンヒルトが玉座の置きどころとなろう。
The book provides a detailed description of this incident. So in regards to this particular bit here, Rebelu himself had low hopes for this envoy, and this guy was a TV commentator prior to becoming a politician, and had really thought that he could turn away the Imperial Armada with just his tongue. At this point, the book simply mentions that Oberstein was left home alone. Other details about their positioning were scattered in the book, mainly between these 2 fragments. Combining these thematically connected details into one scene allows for a more comprehensive understanding of what exactly is going on with the fleet. Again, the book mentions that the disc was stolen post-factum, when Julian and Young already met, so there's no way the reader can sympathize here. There's no mention about Konev utilizing his connections and military police dropouts to help them out. The fact that Yulin has deduced where Young would be is also mentioned post-factum, completely removing the build-up they managed to create in the anime. The Emperor cared little for Iserlohn at this point. This piece follows exactly the same dynamic, where the anime creates an emotional build-up and tries to reproduce a linear story. The book goes for the surprise element. What I mean by it is that this whole scene with Odets takes place after Hilda receives a report about Royenthal's possible revolt. But wait, this time, there's more! You see, it is only at the end of the volume 7 that we hear it through Dominik's words that it was Rubinsky's plan all along. The anime reveals the fact that it's one of Rubinsky's schemes right away, because it's literally the one who talks to Odets, which is unbecoming of a mastermind if you ask me, in this newly introduced scene. This is also where in the anime, they mention the fact that he used to work in the media, implying that he knows a thing or two about public opinions. A series of dialogifications takes place here as well, just trust me on this one. According to the book, the way he treats his beret here resembled their marshal's mannerism. This one surprised me a lot actually, but Julian was slightly worried about this reunion. This is where the book spoils what's to come. Unbelievable to be honest. Some people of Alpha Seal were afraid that Young's arrival would turn them into an autocracy. This whole scene is based only on this one line in the book. Great work. It is also reinforced by Konev telling Yang that Yulian needs to become more independent prior to this scene happening. In the book it happens afterwards. The connection is there, but the emotional weight of Yang's decision is palpable in the anime. The second half, where he crosses out Katerina von Kreutzer, is a separate scene in the book. Merging these two decisions together allows for a great contrast. I always thought that Reinhardt should just call us, you know? I mean, the way Oberstein contacted Lennenkamp, for example. Turns out there's a mixture of factors at play here. They could not contact even Fazan on their way, let alone their vanguard led by Bittenfeld. The star's unstable surface caused heavy radio interference. Only once they were a few hundred light years away from that area were they able to finally receive the news about Iserlohn. And the obvious one is that Reinhardt had his whole attention on the upcoming battle. This is also mentioned in the anime, by the way. Notice how Lutz's eye color shifts. This is supposed to be his sign of arousal. Murkat was known as the only gentleman of Yang's fleet. This Mashengo throws a fucking pillar heroically moment is not in the book. Another attempt to permeate character's existence through the story, obviously. Just one shot buried 10% and damaged another 10% of Lutz's fleet inside the fortress. There still were 10 times more enemies. Among newly introduced numerous reactions of the commanding officers to certain developments of the battle, 2 more details were added. The part where Reinhardt sees that Grillparzer is diving too much, but just lets it slide to see how things play out. In the book, we don't know whether this comes as a surprise to him or not. The animators make it look like Bukok knew exactly when the solar wind is going to hit, which is not the case in the novel. Oh, and also the second solar wind wave hit is not mentioned in the book. Grillparzer ends up losing about 30% of his troops in that dive. A ton of micro-reactions introduced here to spice things up. Basically, the feeling I got while comparing the adaptation and the novel during this battle is the feeling you'd get when you read a history book. And imagine that it says something like, his keen tactical eye won them the battle at Thermopylae, or more appropriately, the Battle of Borodino, since this whole thing is basically space musketeers.
I can.
Right, where was I? So, you read this line in the book, and you're like, alright, so the guy had some nice eyes, I suppose. You barely feel any substance to that statement, but in the anime, when you actually hear your Kutuzov or Napoleon or Hannibal shouting things, when you see what has driven those decisions, it feels more alive, doesn't it? You might even be able to understand why exactly that guy's keen eye was keen enough to win the battle in the end. Just so you know, the helmsman of Brunhild is one hell of a guy. The man's name is Sigbert Seiditz, age 31, a talented 7th generation scion of the Silas family. Loves to sing, the space is my grave, the ship is my coffin, when he gets drunk, and he does not offer Reinhardt to keep distance. He dodges all of the attacks and Brunhild actively returns fire. The book does not mention that this brief respite of ceasefire happened in such a cool way. They get straight to the contents of the message. This is where I'd like to make a side note. The melody that plays in the background is Wagner's Symphony in C major. A romantic in me wants to believe that they use this melody because it's the only completed symphony of the composer, and this is where both FPI's and Bukok's Symphony of Life ends. But a skeptic in me says that it probably sounded heroic enough. Around this part, Reinhardt has the samurai-like thought that a good life is completed with a good death. In order to make it clear for every single viewer, they use Lanstrator's mouth to voice this question, which was not even deemed worth asking in the book. Lutz could have wiped out Alpha Seal with ease, but saw no meaning in such an act. His opinion might have changed had he known that Yang was there. The events described at the beginning of the episode 73 follow the events of the episode 71 in the book. This means that the novel ends up spoiling the death of Bukok before the battle even happens. I know that it helps to create an immediate dramatic shift between yay, we took the fortress, and god damn it, Bukok is dead. But if you ask me, the profit of keeping such things secret is a lot more valuable to your average reader's engagement, especially when you're about to describe in detail the contents of the battle where that character dies. Yang's upcoming death is being foreshadowed to us multiple times throughout the book. It's up to you to decide whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. Bugok still had 15 more years to reach an average life expectancy. I always discarded this as something insignificant, but actually Sul here cries for the first time in 15 years. In the book, Young mentions the possibility of Rebelo's assassination too late. How late, you ask? Reinhardt had visited Lebero's dead body already late. They insert bits and scraps from different parts of the book here and there. The book mentions that Royenthal's mouth stretched in a smile measurable in microns. This is obviously centimeters, not microns. Awful adaptation. As a matter of fact, this place is supposed to be surrounded with winter roses of many colors. I'm not seeing any roses in here. Also, about 50,000 soldiers participated in the event. This part here is a great illustration of how things get glued together, direct speechified, synchronized, and even mispronounced. To be honest, this one is the only example I found, but more on that later. Let me pick it apart for you. First 10 seconds are a reiteration of Shinkopp's views, which he expressed time and time again, intended to set up the topic of this conversation. Next 10 seconds include direct specification, 良心的な政治家. The foul part, however, is Shinkopp's direct quote. Another 10 seconds that follow immediately are a first part of a mini-scene in the novel that had Shinkopp in it, being merged into this conversation. Then, anime makers pick Young's quote from the beginning of the book. Next 8 seconds are the continuation of the mini-scene that I mentioned before. This is also where Shinkopp's Seiyu mispronounces his line.
信念など有益無害なものだと人には説教しておきながら
completely reversing its meaning, and Translator makes a mistake in a rather simple sentence, but so far he did a lot better than the guy who translated volumes 3 to 6. At 45 seconds, they verbalize Julian's inner thoughts, and then the conversation concludes with a third part of Shinkopp's mini-scene being voiced. Oh, and this here is just some random guy who creates a thematic transition between the scenes. What you see before you is a newly introduced scene to glue things together better. After a conversation between Poplin and Karen, there is a dialogue between Julian and Poplin in the book. Some of the things expressed here end up being dispersed throughout different other scenes. This Rubinsky's line actually belongs to McClinger, who is shown to inscribe it into his memoir in the next episode. Dominic's closing line about the Church of Terror actually comes up at the end of the book. They merged it into this scene to create a thematic transition into Isolon's discussion of the same topic. Young starts laughing here. This is where the novel reminds us that Berger Grün is nervous because he remembers what Royenthal has said to him. I always thought that it's simply because his superior is being questioned. By the way, his presence here is a demonstration of Mueller's respect towards Royenthal. Usually, that would not be permitted.
Mein Kaiser.
The book dubs this Mein Kaiser as the most beautifully pronounced one. Imagine being told to pronounce something like that and delivering just fine. That's Norio Wakamoto for you. 4 sentences that describe the history between the three get converted into a fully functioning flashback with bits and pieces of drama. It is mentioned that McClinger had quite a collection, but never in such detail. This, for example, is Salvador Dali's Atavism at Twilight. Unfortunately, I'm not that deep into art to understand why, out of thousands of paintings, they decided to feature this one front and center. There's also a glimpse of Toshu Sai Sharaku's Koi Nyobo Somoake Tazuna. But again, I'm not certain why would the depiction of a wicked henchman be dropped in here. Aside from the fact that this is Japanese anime, so why not reference something Japanese in it? I might have missed a few more artworks featured during this scene. Maybe someone in the comments has a keen eye for these things. Another detail the book helped me notice is the fact that Kessler is being called Teitoku in this scene. Fact is, he is not but the way they call him shows that they consider him to be an equal even now. Since I always discard such things as regalia-related noise, it brought a smile to my face. Maybe it will bring one to yours as well, hey. He's supposed to be playing this teacup like a piano keyboard. These are the roses they were supposed to be surrounded with during the proclamation. In terms of overall impression, this part is very close to the decalogy, but the animators did 2 things, sound direction and overall visual presentation aside, that made it a lot better.
Basically, in the book, it's just them being busy with the preparations. Julian is not there to connect every scene. The look our young protege and Catherine share during this part is not in the book. The terrorist attack is dropped on us just like that, as a single line in Volume 8, with some of the details, like a dry explanation as to why was Wallen late to the party, being revealed post-factum. In the book, just as with many secondary characters, once you hear about their deaths, your face is like, Thanks to the fact that the director of the series carefully permeated their existence throughout the whole adaptation, we end up feeling a lot more when someone dies. I honestly believe that Silverback's death is one of the saddest deaths in the whole series. Imagine reading a short newspaper article about someone's death and actually experiencing the events that happened to the deceased in chronologically correct order. That's what I'm talking about. Everything past this point is new. I mean, you need to somehow set up the way the two met. You can't just do it newspaper style the way Dakawaji has done it time and time again. The animation makes a jump to Chapter 2 Part 6 to set up the fact that Church of Terror is on the move. A reshuffle here and there happens in order to make it look as if the events unfold in chronological order. Huge violation of the way things are in the book detected. These sandwiches were not that pretty. It was a haphazardly assembled mess of egg, ham, and lettuce. By the way, Young Family is enjoying their toast, omelette, thick pea soup, and yogurt, all made by Frederica under strict guidance of Julian. Julian's height has reached 179.5 centimeters. Newly introduced Happy Family microscene. Under 30% of Young's fleet needed some sort of repairs performed, and 20% of his troops were complete newbies at this point. The book does not mention that it was their last conversation, but it spoiled his upcoming demise so many times at this point that we shouldn't be surprised. Oh, speak of the devil. Turns out, Maclinga's troops are not the only thing hindering Yan from moving deep into the Empire's territory. There's thousands of battleships scattered across different locations. Oddly enough, Fahrenheit's conclusion about Bittenfeld rushing into the battle is wrong. The anime makes it look like Fahrenheit was able to recognize Merkat's signature tactics. This is done by changing the order of the events, fighters enter the story a bit earlier, and attributing the order to launch the Spartans to the Right Wing's commanding officer. In the novel, he simply receives a report that Right Wing is under Merkat's command. This microscene is not here. Very subtle and nice transition. The book does not mention the existence of this super weapon. It was purely Fahrenheit's tactical prowess that created an opening. Attenborough's concentrated fire technique proved to be too good and ended up creating an energy storm. As she bows, she thinks about the only man who would have opposed the Emperor's decision. This attack could have buried the whole Yang's fleet had it been executed at full power. This is supposed to be Reinhardt's rage face. For some reason, it looks to me like the face of a man who has fucked up royally. This retreat of the Imperial forces does not happen in the book. It is Yang who draws back his forces, logically enough, but basically they're fighting the whole time. My guess is that it's indeed the face of a man who thinks he made a mistake and therefore decides to withdraw his forces in the anime, because probably the director decided that ending the episode without any kind of punctuation would be weird. Is not a quote from the Dakawaji. This scene is based on the utterance of Fisher in Volume 10, long after his death. I elaborated on this one at the beginning of the video. This another attempt of Hilde to push for peaceful resolution of this conflict is described in the book when Reinhardt has already proposed peaceful negotiations. In the anime, it happens mid-fight and creates a nice mood shift, as well as sets up the upcoming negotiations. The novel implies that Eisenach is swearing here. The animators put different reactions to Fisher's death right where it happened, thus reinforcing the emotional impact. If it were the way it is in the book, it would be done in 8 seconds because it's just 2 sentences. And yes, our young is wearing his signature sunglasses here as well. Newly introduced scene that sets up Frederica's sickness. A single detail that is missing in the adaptation about Iserlohn's post-hibernation period. Clearly, the author thought that previous spoilers were not enough, and nonchalantly decided to spoil the fact that Young is about to die midway. Oh, this is Yoshiki Tanaka's Magic of Summer. Another great piece of direction takes place here. Basically, the animators remove the conversation between Dovelia and other fanatics, where he explains that Falk is not meant to kill Young. He's just a mannequin out of straw, made only to
to be burned. This completely ruins the surprise we experience when Falk gets blown up by the Imperial destroyers and the sense of false security that gets betrayed immediately afterwards. Also, Dovilia actually hated Falk for the fact that he, unlike him, had a ton of opportunities to advance very high. It always bugged me that the two destroyers that just killed Falk did not open fire at Young's ship once they've confirmed he's on board. And even after I finished reading the volume 8, I still felt like there was nothing to beat this argument. But now I understand that it's...
お前らの負けだ。兵力差でな。
You see, Falk was aboard an armed trading ship. Church of Terra piloted Imperial destroyers were, well, destroyers, and Letter 2 is a cruiser. Basically, there's no way two destroyers can beat the crap out of a cruiser. So it only makes sense that they had to devise a way to board the ship. Another detail I noticed thanks to reading the book is the guy who gets shot here is actually the same guy who shoots Romsky. Yulian and Shenkopf prioritized areas that had any sort of interference going on. As a matter of fact, by the time when they enter the ship, terrorists still outnumber them. Another meticulous reproduction of the metaphor in the book is the visual representation of Young's death.
Side note time!
Notice how a second movement of Rachmaninoff's third piano concerto that the composer himself entitled as Intermezzo sets up the mood shift. Julian sort of enters an emotional intermission between intense realization and bitter acceptance of Young's death. Beautiful. Here's what goes through Julian's mind at that moment. Blumhardt follows Young into Valhalla or whatnot 15 minutes after. Turns out, in the original, they were still fighting the cultists. Shenkopf ordered to pick up the bodies and leave. This information about both Patrichev and Blumhardt sucking at chess is brought up in the earlier episode in the form of a joke. Valhalla in this line gets edited out. Another line of Shenkopf from before received similar treatment. The reason is obvious, because this is not the way FBA people talk, though in case of Shenkopf, one may call it sort of okay. This is where in the background, Brahms' Symphony No. 3, Poco Allegretto starts playing. This melody has quite a backstory that strongly resonates with what's going on with our characters. Keep in mind that what you're about to hear is just my speculations. There's no record of Brahms ever saying it directly, but it is believed that the structure of his symphony follows his signature FAF motto. Brahms' self-proclaimed friend and biographer Max Kalbeck, whose biography is believed by some to be full of opinions and not facts, identified FAF as a musical cipher for frei aber froh, free but happy. However, quote, the three notes that begin the symphony are not FAF, but FA flat F. Though the key of the symphony is F major, the note A flat belongs to F minor, and imbues the opening with a sense of conflict and instability. Indeed, the conflict between F major and F minor will drive the entire symphony, only reaching resolution in its final pages. For Brahms, could this alteration have symbolized doubt or conflicted feelings about his free but happy motto? Perhaps, but he may have made the change for purely musical reasons as well. End quote. This strongly resonates with the way our heroes should be feeling right now. They were free but happy, but now they are free but unhappy. The whole Matsuri is over now. Again, this is probably just me pulling things out of my ass, you know? But the connection is there, so let me just...
滅びの美学を完成させるのだ。
あの人が私の傍らで半分眠りながら本を読んでいてくれたら。
This delivery here always leaves me speechless. Usually whenever there's a commentary provided by the author as to how a certain line was pronounced, the actors reproduce it without a hitch. However, this line here had no such commentary. So this is a product of wonderful direction and pure voiceover talent. This 2-minute long chapter is actually from the next volume, that is volume 9 of the Decalogy. As you might have guessed, this is another instance of synchronization here. Some of the lines here were used in the book separately. For example, Royenthal says this line to Bergengruen only, and this line of our Black Lancer actually belongs to some random soldiers. They compiled it all into a
single scene to make it more coherent and easier to digest. Due to the fact that the anime version did not mention a few emperors during their Imperial Historical Records arc, they had to edit out any mention of said emperors in this conversation. It has more real feel to it in the book, thanks to this detail. The novel again ends up doing its signature asynchronous storytelling, and unveils the story of Muller's visit to Iserlohn when Imperial troops have already withdrawn. That is, Royenthal has already arrived to Heinessen, and Reinhard has reached Fazan, which is not as cool as having it shown to us in the correct order. You might have guessed by their facial expressions here, but even among civil servants, Lang was a despised man. Just to be clear, this guy actually had no idea and is surprised to discover that his wild guess hit the bullseye. The book provides more details as to how was Rubinsky able to contact Lang. It was a letter by Dominic. On the other hand, the book never mentioned that one of Rubinsky's hideouts was an underwater mansion. In the novel, Rubinsky manages to bust out a metaphor in his condition, and Dominic retaliates with a metaphor and a wordplay in return. This part followed immediately after his conversation with Hilda, which would be 1758, this fragment. Anime version moves it at the end of the episode to end things on a melancholic note. Katerina just drops all 3 lines in a row without any sort of reaction being described in the book. Here, her utterance is intermixed with newly introduced Julian's reactions that add that little oomph to the whole scene and make it more memorable. The population of Iserlohn Fortress was only a fifth of what it had been during its heyday 3 years ago. This is mentioned in numbers twice, but never in percentage. Julian was shouting right away, and the anime Poplin starts to chant and encourages Julian to join him. Here's where we end up in a peculiar situation. Usually a single volume of LOGH could cover 9 to 10 episodes of the anime series. Currently, however, we have extra 3 episodes. So I'm going into this thinking that probably we'll see a lot of stretching going on. And there you go. This long flashback is not mentioned anywhere in the Decalogy. I suppose the director decided to follow his own Nindo here. The book never mentions that Mittermeier proposed this plan. He was, however, among those who end up executing it. This attribution allows the animators to seamlessly transition to their foreshadowing dialogue about storm gathering, and then to add a little bit more drama to the whole thing by showing at the end of this episode that on both planets there's a storm. And the only thing about weather mentioned in the book at this point is the fact that it's late summer. 98% of this episode's contents are scattered throughout the book, but are combined in a way that completely resembles the original. This little fragment here is an amalgamation of bits and pieces all over the book. The conclusion Attenborough arrives to is based on a historical review of Iserlohn's predicament, and this part is a nice addition based on this notion from Volume 9 that this was Young's favorite bench. It allows for a smooth transition to the next topic of their conversation, that is Marshall Young. After that, it's all according to the original. Here's a full quote of what pops up in Julian's mind at that moment. Starting from 35 is a separate scene in the book that gets merged into this one. So in the book, Trönich just pops up on this screen. In the anime, this information gets delivered to them by Konev, who also mentions that he saw De Villiers entering Trönich's residence. The introduction of these details into this scene allows to achieve 3 things. Make his visit seem like a normal thing, create a stronger ending than just, oh, looky here, it's Trönich, and sets up the thematical transition into Julian's desire to avenge Young by destroying the Church of Terror. There are 2 doctors dressed up as military men. This Jürgens guy was known as the Iron Stomach. Very important, I know. The assassin had a hard-to-detect knife and a cyanide spray. Emil is supposed to be in tears here. Additional commentary about what goes on through Hilda's mind as she decides to spend the night with him. The first 30 seconds are newly introduced bits. What's more important here is what we hear in the background is the 6th Symphony of Mahler, 3rd movement, at least according to the composer's original intention. Andante moderato. If this source I found that mentions his wife's commentary is to be trusted, in the 3rd movement the composer tries to express, quote, the unrhythmical games of the 2 children tottering in zigzags over the sand. Ominously, the childish voices became more and more tragic, and at the end died out in a whimper. So this is a portrayal of 2 children who are unaware of the upcoming tragedy. So befitting. Kissling never spoke to anyone about this incident, by the way.
butler actually wanted Hilda to be born as a man. This is where the book reveals that Royenthal is going to revolt. Another example of great direct speechification.
ベルゲングリウム、念のために警備の兵を1万、いや2万。
In the book around here, the crowd begins to chant the following song. Anime again adds more subtlety to the event by introducing the Erzheimer's reaction to people getting too hard-headed and his direct order to not use weapons in suppression of the riots. This line is then connected to another newly introduced line of Royenthal that shows his trust in his subordinate, and we've seen a visualized proof of the fact that it's not misplaced. After that, there is another instance of direct specification till 0725. From there on, it's all by the book, except for Stolle's last line. The book immediately quotes Young after Royenthal's line. These words of Bergengruen are not in the book. Overall verbal activity of his character is very low in the novels, so you again might find it hard to sympathize with his suicide in the end. The anime converts this dialogue flashback into a different dialogue and sprinkles an occasional joke in there. In the novel, Royenthal throws the letter on the table and observes Trünich's reaction as he reads it. Newly introduced part. After that, for another 45 seconds, direct specification takes place. She does not end the sentence with Julian, avoiding weird implications. If you ever wanted to know the detailed rules of this little game called Horsmania, there you go. I find it hard to believe, so I checked it like 4 times, but the book never mentions this scene anywhere, and it is actually huge. If I recall correctly, a long time before this scene, Oberstein has already ordered to keep an eye on Lang, so you might consider this as a logical conclusion of that order, but it makes it look like Oberstein again fucked things up for the sake of his stupid no number 2's ideal. The author has provided a plenty of commentary during Rubinsky and Lang's dialogue, so the anime makers converted it into a separate scene between Rubinsky and Dominic. This scene follows post factum in the book. Synchronization. Fortress exposition happens when Mueller later brings it up during his conversation with Mittermeier in the elevator. By providing us with this information during the meeting, they were able to incorporate Admiral commentaries into their post-meeting interactions. Also, this is an introduced joke. So this here is a combination of Kissling's driving technique and built-in evasive systems. Whoa, there's a grammatical error in English translation. Even this guy is not without a fault. Royenthal is surprised because Lutz's sister is married to this Arsheimer Minchi Chokan. You might have guessed that there's some kind of connection there, when in the episode 95, Royenthal offers an apology. The rest is pretty much the same. What you need to understand is that there is a ridiculous amount of reshuffles going on behind the scenes. The book simply says that Lang was demonstrating the full extent of his silver tongue. In the anime, we get to experience that extent. Hilda also wanted to remove Oberstein from his position, but unlike with Lang, had nothing tangible to support it. He smashes the monitor with his fist in the anime, but in the book he just looks at it angrily. Considering what you should be feeling right now, I like the broken monitor version more. The words "which one," Germany, and "the same" in Japanese are almost homophones. With that in mind, consider the following sentence.
Fire! Fire!
Get it? They both speak the same German here.
まずいな。
申し訳ありません。
いや、宣教画だ。
Most unfortunately, this coffee joke is not in the book. Royenthal actually noticed the ceramic shard thingy there to pierce him, and could have dodged it, but the chair dropped a huge debuff on his agility/mobility stat and restricted his movements. Ironically enough, Lutz received the same injury prior to his death. Our heterochromatic commander thinks to himself that his death should be suitable to the deaths of his fellow admirals. Basically, it's not that he knew his wound was lethal or anything, it's just that he got a Bushido boner that needs some attention. His deck looked like a bloody mess in the book. It is very odd, but this dialogue is not in the book. There is no further explanation as to what has happened to the betraying fleet once Tristan got hit. Next thing we hear about them is Grillpautz's surrender. Rittersdorf does not exist on any page of the Decalogy, as well as this trilogue. Royenthal's return is split into 2 parts with Maclinga's investigation in the anime version. This metaphor.
Too bad you can't possibly deliver it visually the way it's supposed to be perceived in the book, really. The following line in the anime delivers the same thought though. Royenthal compares Trunich to a monster, an amoeba that has ego at its core and devours everything outside. Oh, another nice metaphor from the book. Royenthal changed history when he killed Trunich. It took all of his remaining powers, as if he were a knight who slayed a poisonous wyvern. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. This is what Royenthal thinks in between these lines to himself. In the book, the handkerchief is dripping with sweat, which meant that she was there for a while. Kinda sad that the animators dismissed this detail. In the novel, Royenthal's last words are inaudible, and we only get a chance to read what the boy has written down a bit later. Mittermeier arrived only 2 hours late. Mittermeier is supposed to remove his own cape and drape it above his friend's shoulders. I think the implications of him using a flag and his own cape are quite different, with the latter having a somewhat more extra-governmental, intimate context. It's not perfectly clear what exactly Royenthal's dying words were supposed to mean. Initially, Bergengruen was talking via Visiphone, then he cut the connection and shot himself. I guess him talking through the door is more emotional, but have nothing to back it up. This nurse could have received 100,000 imperial marks per year. Judging by the fact that this amount of money is enough to fund a whole foundation, this is a lot of money. Again, less drama. Lang hears about Royenthal's death 2 months later. Basically, this means that in the book, Rubinsky had a lot more time to prepare his escape. This little detail is so easy to miss, but this is actually his right hand that was injured during Urawashi incident. Oh, another new microscene. The reason why all of a sudden she brings up the topic of pregnancy is because she understood that Reinhardt's question was an expression of kindness. This dialogue is actually used in the book to introduce a huge personality breakdown of our young emperor. She is the second person Anne Rose has asked of this, the first one being Kirchiais, obviously, so this is a big deal. At the end of their dialogue, Anne Rose points out the fact that Reinhard never had a father figure in his life, which resulted in him redirecting that anti-father energy on the emperor. The death of Erwin Joseph II is described in the last volume of the Decalogy, Chapter 1, Part 4, and it's very dry and descriptive. To put it shortly, a huge direct specification and synchronization. Since this is an event that takes place in November, by the time we reach Chapter 4 of the Decalogy, the story has progressed well past this point. It's the Imperial Year 801 already. The book reveals the fact that Reinhard is indeed sick, and not just exhausted, right off the bat. Another reason things went under the radar was because he ordered his doctors to look after the pregnant Hilda. This random dude who drops a low-quality comment is supposed to be Silverberg's replacement. This time, the book decides to spoil Reinhard's approximate period of death. Another long instance of direct specification. Notice how a descriptive text devoid of emotions gets converted into a lively performance. I guess after 2 hours, it's about time I reveal to you why I made this video. This is the main reason why I made it. This squirrel is not in the book. This scene is not that detailed in the final installment of the Decalogy. 3 short statistical paragraphs is all there is. Karen's psychological state is not portrayed in the book here, as well as any kind of combination play between her and Poplin. Julian licks his dried out lips in the book. Judging by the way such mannerism is usually expressed in the industry, they chose wisely. As a matter of fact, the book mentions the possibility of Bog Industry reporting the hidden fleet to Wally, but even then there was a possibility of this message never reaching him because of the interference. There was an extra layer of depth to it, which ends up not being mentioned by Mittermeier. Behold, honey apple juice. The book makes a transition from Julian's thoughts about Rubinsky into an actual scene involving Rubinsky. The anime drops a birthday celebration ceremony in between these two scenes and thematically connects Reinhardt's illness with Rubinsky's state of health. The professor's name is not mentioned at this point in the book. However, it will be mentioned among the deceased in the next episode. These are newly introduced lines. Bittenfeld's line before Mueller enters his room is also new. Julian was joking here, but people took him too seriously. I think the initial meaning was lost in between the lines. Prison Riot has a few things going on that are worth noting. The book immediately reveals the outcome of the riot before going into any details, so we immediately know how many people died, who got injured, what happened to the medical brigade, etc. The anime, again, delivers things in the correct order without revealing the outcome. This allows to achieve suspense and keep the viewer engaged throughout the whole chain of events. What happens here is Warren was shot with a heat-seeking rifle, and the fire nearby ends up redirecting the shot. The book does not mention a freaking bazooka firing back at the assassin. I think I'm not the only one who thought that it's not like Murai to join the riot. Turns out I was correct. His injury has nothing to do with active participation in the riot. Here's the contents of their conversation. Karen tries to cheer Julian up the only way she knows, by going full tsundere. Another timeline synchronization pertaining to this mention takes place. In particular, this renovation joke is the first part, and this is the second part. The novel describes these events, one after another, but mentions that there is a time gap between the two. Just so you know, these fanatics were originally planning to purify them by fire, so it makes sense their assassination tactics were meh. There were no cameras installed because they didn't want to interfere with Kaiserin's private life. He smiles because she called him 5 ranks below his actual rank. Kessler's signature military police cap might not have been there at all. According to the book, Anne Rose did end up injuring herself during this heroic act. Direct specification of this part of the book. This lady is 17 at the moment. She's 20 years younger than Kessler. Terrorists indeed had a plan to assault the hospital. There's no handshake in the book. They were playing outside, then enjoyed some shower and hot chocolate. The book elaborates on the subject of Prince and Reinhardt.
Alexander Siegfried von Lohengrin.
Almost every single line here is new. The rest are direct specifications of things like damaged engine or Sun Tzu's question. Reinhardt is enjoying a bath of stars here, by the way. I suppose the animators do manage to show that he's sort of chilling here. The book uses the word spider. Animators replaced it with an octopus. Side note time! This is pronounced in Japanese as Kyofu to Zetsubo no sausage. The sausage of fear and despair! The novel mentions Poplin's return to the ship, but not his departure, so it only makes sense they introduced this missing link to the chain of events. The anime does this very nice thing, where it introduces Julian's thoughts about Reinhardt as he boards the ship. This builds up tension and reinforces the idea that this is a very high-stakes maneuver. Another direct specification, Shankopf is speaking in fluent Imperial Standard language here. Mashengo's last words are not a part of the Decalogy. 5 years ago, there were 1,960 Rosenritters. Only 204 have lived to tell the tale. 40% of Iserlohn troops have lost their lives in this battle. Young's ship, Hyperion, did not survive this battle. It held a special place in Frederica's heart. She reminisces about it, among other things, when she enters her and Young's quarters for the last time. An example of characterization would be the way he shortens Hanga Storaiki to Hansto, which suits him well as a character. Had he not shortened it like that, people like me might have thought that he was about to perform an airstrike on some sort of hangar. Converted into a dialogue. Direct specification. The book provides the following argument in support of Dominic's statement. On average, 2 out of 5 times, Julian's sense of humor managed to pierce the young emperor's armor. Also, a little bit of language barrier was there. The book is also written fully in Japanese, so we can only imagine how these exchanges were supposed to sound like. It probably involved a lot of Germanese. It might look like Reinhardt makes a huge concession here, but if you really think about it, he does not. This isn't nighttime. It's just that the weather needed to do some dramatic foreshadowing, you know? And also to disable the defense systems of Reinhardt's residence, Deus Ex Machina style, to allow for some dramatic encounters. Reinhardt's death is accompanied by Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. The first movement is described by some as dreamy, and indeed, their short exchange involves the topic of dreams. I always considered this desperate final push by Develia, and what's more important, his direct participation in it, to be out of character, but the final chapter of the Decalogy elaborates on this subject, dismissing my doubts. The anime version actually delivers this fact through his lines. It's just that I failed to notice it. The book beautifully describes Oberstein's death as suitable for a shadow, since even in death he joined his master.
I think the people who translated the box would totally agree with me, but Yoshiki Tanaka definitely has a thing for heterochromia. I'm talking about this. Heterochromia. 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 Heterochromia, 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 chromia, chromia. Obviously, there are moments where the box had more liberty of expression, so to say, and by that I don't mean the censorship. I mean things like detailed descriptions provided by the author as to what is happening during a certain moment, or some unsaid things. But as I have already said, most of these are perfectly conveyed with the animation itself, so I'm not considering these as something detrimental to the story, and we definitely should take into account the constraints of the mediums being discussed, time constraints for the anime, and visual/auditory constraints for the books. Sadly, I was not able to perfectly separate things the books provide more information on with things that were somehow tweaked in the anime. The general idea was to mention context-dependent details out of the book during the first part, and the rest in the second part. Feel free to bash me in the comments all you like. Here's the list of things that are less context dependent. Let's start by mentioning the obvious. Grunewald means green forest. Iserlohn is the only heavenly body there, aside from the star Altena. The squad that infiltrated the fortress actually had even prepared IDs. The commanding officer does not order them to give up right away, like he does in the anime. This happens when they fill the room with Zephyr particles. The book also defines what these particles are. At the same time, the adaptation introduced a couple of good details. For example, the movement trick by Young, Oberstein's escape, events that followed after the surrender of the commanding officer are also more detailed in the anime version. The author mentions why Anne Rose had not become pregnant after all these years by the Emperor's side. He was afraid after previous failures to lose Anne Rose like that. Fezan's economic overtake is presented in more details. Many people might have hated the fact that space battles are sort of represented in 2D. There's two things to consider here. This is 1980s. The amount of detail would have blown poor painter's mind. And the second one, there's this quote from the book that probably would explain, alleviate, why things look so simple. In the novel, it is revealed that each soldier's uniform has integrated climate control. The books describe your standard battleship arsenal and friend-foe identification systems, using Ulysses as an example. There's more details about Iserlohn's surface. Later we'll see how good it is at its job. It had 200,000 bunks in hospitals and could manufacture 7,500 fusion missiles per hour. I really like the fact that the author calls Kazonas a de facto mayor of Iserlohn. This allows to better understand the gravity of his importance. The book provides a detailed description of the place where Bucock and Young meet. It was not just a park. They even order some stuff, and Young reminisces about fish and chips and a small incident involving Jessica and this place. When Heinesen coup d'etat happens, the book provides a full list of amendments to the Charter of the Alliance. Some of the provisions, number 11 for example, are pretty extreme and sadly are not mentioned in the adaptation. Konev was transporting cultists for a very low fee, 1/10 of what a passenger ship would have cost, because legally they were treated as cargo, and even in the event of an accident, compensation could not be paid for loss of life, while Fahrenheit was not executed on the spot for defying Braunschweig. The end of the FBA part in Book 2 covers a meeting between Trunicht, Negroponte, Capron, Bonnet, Dumek, and Islands, where they discuss what to do with their political enemy, Yang Wenli. It leaves quite an ominous aftertaste, especially when Trunicht claims something along the lines of, "We need Yang so long as there's empire, but sometimes a failure, so long as it's not lethal, could teach a man many things." As far as I understand, the contents of their discussion are compressed into this scene. There's a detailed description of each Spartanian's authentication procedure and the insights of a pilot cabin. McClinger did not want to join the military. One Spartanian pilot training fee is 20 times higher than Young's yearly income. During his days in isolation, Young ponders why he might be erased by Heinesen authorities. Reinhardt started drinking a lot more after he lost Kiki Eyes. A detailed description of where exactly Grunewald has lived when Hilda came to visit.
The book compares the 7-year-old infant emperor to some sort of Jack the Kaiser of LOGH universe, August the Bloodletter. This is a long paragraph. The reason he cannot get rid of him the same way Erich von Ringendorf did with that abomination of an emperor is because he's too young, and obviously things have not escalated to that extent. Young on the subject of God. Oh, you can come up with many explanations as to why this was blue penciled. Young used to buy things that cost a lot more than his own for Julian. Around the time when Ragnarok takes place, Yoshiki Tanaka drops a story about a small base JL-77. Here's what some of the Imperial soldiers enjoy for their meals. What doctors do during the battle. 3 small but nice details related to Young's audience with Reinhardt. Young expected the offer to join Reinhardt's ranks, and even might have accepted it had he not thought about it in advance. Young actually understood whom Reinhardt meant by a lost friend, and here's what runs through Young's head on his way back. Full description of Bara Treaty. A story of the 3-day massacre that took place on the Earth. Young on the subject of God and destiny. Lebro's ability to unite the nation, ironically enough, was weaker than that of Trünicht. The book provides an example of just how efficient Trünicht's propaganda was. Fezzan was not exactly the heaven where everyone enjoyed equal opportunities, and Reinhardt's arrival created new ripples in the power balance. I suppose the newly introduced scene with Silverberg also aimed to demonstrate some of the things mentioned here. Young on Ideals. The book provides additional details about Eisenach the Wordless. There's a lengthy excerpt from Julian's diary, where our young protege tries to explain why Young never took the reins into his hands. Konev's imaginary unvoiced commentary about Julian here ends up being merged into his dialogue with Young, further reinforcing the idea that Julian needs to leave the nest. Dominik's full name, Mittermeier's thoughts about Oberstein and Roenthal. The reason why Andrew Falk's disappearance was not investigated thoroughly was because FBI officials were afraid to attract too much attention of the Imperials. Develier considered Rubinsky to be his enemy. Marindorf Sr. criticized the Iserlohn expedition, considering it the same thing as shooting a mouse with a cannon. It is explained in the Decalogy why would someone as important as Müller be tasked with guarding the Empire's rear. This Rolf Otto Brauchitsch guy actually served under Kircheis and is under Reinhardt's direct command. Just so you know, the author clearly understands that no one would hear you in space. Yoshiki Tanaka tries to explain that Kircheis' appearance in Reinhardt's dream is nothing esoteric. An officer who replaced Fischer on his post might have been skillful enough, but Young had nothing to prove it. This was the main reason why he agreed to the negotiations. Ironically enough, Konev had crossed his path with Young 30 hours before he was able to contact Iserlohn. On his way to save Young, Julian has the following thoughts. Maybe he should have warned the Imperial troops that FBA extremists are about to make an attempt on Marshall's life. Maybe they should have asked for an escort from the very beginning. Then again, this might have made things even more complicated for Young. Ironically enough, in his attempt to protect democracy, Falk will end up burying it. Reinhardt had no intention to offer peace twice, so this was a one-shot thing for Young. A lot of people on the Imperial side, from simple soldier to the Twin Ramparts, did not enjoy the fact that they retreated right when they could have seized the victory. This could be one of the key ideas that the author was trying to show us. Reinhardt's epitaph will only have his name and date inscribed on it. A little bit more about Hilde's father and how the aristocrats were treated under the new regime. Here's how Royenthal defended Bergergrün's promotion when he sensed that some younglings like Grillpauzer and Knappstein thought that it's unfair. Cancer has been defeated for more than 1500 years in this universe at this point. On the subject of ideological difference of the deaths of Young and Bukak, Julian recalls a few more things about Young before he leaves the room to talk to Frederica. In short, why he never wrote a book on tactics and why they didn't pick the route of nomads. It is said that Reinhardt pointed all the beauties sent to his bedroom the other direction.
historians on Young's greatest achievement being a peaceful transition of power within the organization, Julian wanted to become a historian when everything's over. Young on the subject of telling your kids to follow in some random great guy's steps. A rumor about Royenthal's rebellious spirit. According to the box, the reason why Lang could never surpass Rubinsky or Oberstein is because he can't look at his reflection in the mirror and laugh. Oh, nice rain metaphor. A little bit more details about the planet Uruwashi. Our heterochromatic admiral wanted to see his own death, and one more from Royenthal on the subject of allegiances in democratic society. The success of Church of Terror's schemes cannot be purely attributed to their skills. It's as if random scribbles ended up receiving critical praise. The Heinessen upheaval could have been avoided had Royenthal listened to Bergengrun's advice to travel directly to Fezzan. Julian thinks that even if Royenthal revolt succeeded, there is no way everyone would recognize him as the new emperor. It remains to be seen why would the author use the word loyalty like that. I hope it's not for the show-off purposes. Basically, this is the way it looks in the original text. Even when Royenthal gets stripped of his title, other officers still referred to him by his former rank. More on Reinhardt and Hilda's marriage. This was the first interplanetary travel for Anne Rose, and it was a long one. One of the reasons why it was a lot easier for Julian to command his fleet at that moment is because the size was very small. The timing of Julian's plan had to be perfect. Even 1 hour delay could have resulted in complete defeat. Wallen's flagship is called Salamander. Historians on the subject of Reinhardt preventing the collapse of the empire into multiple states. A few thoughts Kaisarin has on her current situation, about her brother's reaction to Reinhardt's illness, raising an heir to the whole galaxy, and other various subjects. Many of Oberstein's subordinates developed some sort of stomach-related condition. Oberstein probably wanted a tabula rasa kind of an emperor. The author sets up another story by mentioning among the people released by Mueller the name of Aubrey Coughlin. Some of you might remember how Young poetically compared Reinhardt to a burning fire. Well, Stride had come up with his own metaphor that is less romantic but might be just as accurate. Another Kirchheis-related flashback and a spoiler of Reinhardt's death. Chapter 6 of the final volume begins with a lengthy essay on the subject of genius. Is Reinhardt a genius? Is Young a genius? And Julian's perspective on the subject. This is, for the most part, a reiteration of things we've heard and seen throughout the story. Kessler visited Hilda every day and they enjoyed a game of chess occasionally. Here's how Kessler reformed the military police. He urged people to report any mistreatment by the officers, invited a lot of war veterans into his organization, and also not much of a reform but a habit of his, never allowed any detail pertaining to his private life to be known. Young makes a joke about his epitaph. This is very important. His paper cup is filled with whiskey. After the Battle of Shiva, Mittermeier required alcohol to fall asleep. Dominic has provided solid proof that Fezzan, Church of Terror, and Trunicht were in cahoots. What was Reinhardt's condition actually about? The final volume goes into detail as to what exactly Trunicht did to achieve his ultimate goal. I assume you're all sleeping at this moment. Well, rejoice! We are done here! Now for the one last thing left. In his afterword to the final volume of the Decalogy, Yoshiki Tanaka mentions a few things that I found interesting enough, that later editions might have slight edits introduced. For example, the accent on different calendars needed to be stronger. He perfectly understands that you can't have every single planet be that close to Earth's climate and seasons, that this story will never see continuation past volume 10. He was actually known amongst some as Tanaka the Slaughterer, way before R.R. Martin popularized the idea of dead characters. Even if he had a chance to postpone Kirchheis's death, it would not be delayed by a huge margin. And also that Poplin's fate in peaceful times can only go two ways, City Hunter or Red Butler. Let me end this by saying that it is actually shocking how true to the source the anime version is. We are talking more than 10 years of honest work here. The amount of love and respect shown to the original books can be felt all over the place. Most subtleties were carefully reproduced by the staff, and my god, what a wholesome acting they pulled off to convey emotions via both image and sound. The book is the proud, healthy skeleton upon which all the muscles and skin that is animation rests. But if I were to pick a partner for a night, I'd definitely go with someone who has muscles and skin. This leaves me wondering just how many great science fiction literary works could have blown our minds if they were adapted the same way Legend of the Galactic Heroes was. I gotta go. I have a universe to conquer. Oh, right, the pun! Church of Terror? More like Church of Terrorists. I hope you enjoyed this little 2-hour long demonstration of my